James will have to do the opposite in just a minute. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lisa German, the University Librarian and Dean of Libraries here at the University of Minnesota, and welcome to our campus and to the Elmer L. Anderson Library. As you all know, Jean-Nickolaus Tretter was a remarkable man who also had a magnificent vision to preserve the history of the LGBTQ community. He also possessed the necessary characteristics to realize his vision: passion, courage, and generosity. Thanks to Jean, the University of Minnesota Libraries is now home to the Jean-Nickolaus Tretter Collection, one of the largest LGBTQ-specific archives in the United States. Hear myself again. The Tretter Collection is international in scope, featuring materials in 60 languages. It's also the home to the Tretter Transgender Oral History Project, the world's largest oral history collection on transgender, genderqueer, and non-binary people. The university, indeed all of us, have been blessed by Jean's foresight, his commitment, and his legacy. And today I am so pleased, and it is so fitting that you're here to celebrate his life. This afternoon, we'll hear from a number of people who were close to Jean. We'll also have performances from the Twin Cities Gay Men's Chorus Chamber Singers. I know, I'm looking forward to that as well. And now I'd like to turn this over to Jean's longtime friend, James Garlow, who will serve as MC and who will also deliver the eulogy. James.
Thank you for the kind words, Dean. We appreciate being here today, and thank you for allowing us to celebrate Jean's life in this magnificent library that he loved so much. Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. My name is James Garlow, and I am humbled to serve as the Master of Ceremonies and a speaker at today's ceremony. On behalf of the Ringrose family, thank you for being here. And hope you'll bear with us. We have some technological challenges as things go on, and it'll be fine. We'll make it work. Jean meant so much to so many people. He was a Navy veteran, an archivist, a local cultural icon, a force of nature, a friend, a son, an uncle, a great uncle, a scholar, a visionary, a writer, a gay man, and a civil rights pioneer. These are some of the titles that we can ascribe to his remarkable life. Throughout this celebration, as we remember Jean, I ask that you each reflect on what Jean meant to you personally in your life, and allow those thoughts to guide your personal remembrance throughout our ceremonies today and in the days to come. Jean asked that any service conducted in honor of his life and legacy be conducted as a celebration of life. He did not want a maudlin sackcloth and ashes service. He did want drag queens to be ripping their wigs off and screaming and crying, but it doesn't look like he's going to get that today. He said to leave the depression to the emo twinks. Jean wanted those who knew him best, the archives and the LGBTQ plus community he cherished, and his family and his friends worldwide to find joy in his life and to celebrate that. That's not to say that he was opposed to sadness and weeping. After all, the drag queens were supposed to be here. Mostly he wanted that because he wanted to thumb his nose at the military and the military's silly rule against gay and lesbian people back in his day. The military was saved this scene by Jean's choosing to leave us and be interred on a day when it was 40 degrees below zero. Even with long johns, 3 pairs of pants, and electrically heated socks, I was still frozen in places I did not know that I could be frozen. It was so cold the flag bearers could not fold the flag. I believe I lost count at 9. One rifle bearer tried to shoot himself in the foot with a blank. So I tell people that Gene got a 22 gun salute, which is better than a 21 gun salute, and that's Gene right there. Gene would have had a great laugh at our discomfort that day, but he would have appreciated that many of his friends and family were at Fort Snelling for the internment. Because of the cold, we abbreviated the internment service and omitted the music. Gene had requested some specific songs to be played at his service, some religious and some not, and we'll do our best to honor his wishes today. As many of you know, Gene was a cryptologic technician in the Navy. His talent with languages was absolutely remarkable. I never got the same answer from Gene, but personally I heard him engage in fluent conversations with people in at least 8 different languages. He told me once he could muddle through about 25 more, and I don't think he honestly knew how many he could learn. To honor his love of language, some of the music today will be presented in other languages. About 17 years ago, in 2006, Gene and the Tretter Collection, along with the folks at the Quatrefoil Library, created and hosted the first ever GLBT Archives, Libraries, Museums, and Special Collections Alms Conference right here in this beautiful library, right in this room. Some very special friends of Gene's came from New Zealand. Dr. Elizabeth Carey, a member of New Zealand Parliament, and her partner, Alofa Ayano. Our first speaker will be Dr. Carey. And bear with me on the technology. If this thing will cooperate.
Kia ora koutou, Elizabeth Kere here, speaking to you from work here at Parliament in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm speaking on behalf of me and my wife, Alofa Ayano, and just acknowledging the grief, the upsetness, but also the absolute heart for all of us to celebrate the life of Gene. I first met Gene when Shamey, who I know is there, brought him to our place after the Gay Games in Sydney 2002. One of the memories that particularly stands out is because we're on our way from dinner and this young Asian man started chatting to Gene, and it was like the rest of us were invisible. He was just totally mesmerized by Gene and flirting outrageously, and of course Gene was lovely and chuffed and graceful. But after that, we brought Gene home and Shamey to our marae, our ancestral meeting house in Gisborne, where I'm from, to work with my father. And it was just a really, really beautiful experience having him there. It wasn't until a few years later Gene was responsible as part of the crew that brought Alofa and I over to Minnesota to be part of the first ALMS conference. Now, I know that there are many people there, family, close friends, people who have known him for many, many years. And even though it's been years since we met him, we haven't had that ongoing close relationship. But from the other side of the world, key things that we remember is about his absolute passion for his collection and the art of collecting, the art of telling stories and preserving memories. And I think that is something that cuts across cultures, across spiritualities, and across nations. And it's that connection I was really feeling today in front of Parliament. We had another rally, a counter rally to anti-transphobes and TERFs, and we're part of the group celebrating our trans, non-binary, intersex communities. And several of our young people talked about the history of trans activism and where that fits in the bigger picture. And this is part of the legacy that Gene gives, is the retention of those histories that will enable our young people, all of the people going forward, to know what we call our whakapapa, what we call our genealogy, our activist genealogy, and the elders who even not necessarily paved the way, but created the space for many of us to pave different ways, all for the liberation of our communities. And Jean was someone for me that just completely and absolutely epitomised that. He is a bright light to be lost from our world. So ngā mihi atu ki a koe, haere ki ngā whetū kua whetū rangitia. We leave you to go up and be amongst the stars, back to your ancestors, back to all of those you have lost, and we will always, always remember you. Kia ora.
Thank you, Dr. Carey. My understanding is that she and her partner are watching on the live stream. So in part to honor the New Zealand connection, this is a song that Jean wanted played at his service, but it'll be presented in Maori.
Whakaria mai Tori peka kia Tia ho mai I roto I te po Hei kona titiro atu ai ora mate hei au koe no ai Whakaria mai, dori peka kia, tia ho mai, I roto I te pō. Hei kona Consider all the worlds thy hands have made. I see the stars, I hear the rolling thunder, all the power throughout the universe displayed. Then sings my soul, my Savior God,
At this time, I'd like to introduce a very longtime friend of Jean's, Mr. Shamie Kramer, to speak.
Thank you, James. Good afternoon. And to our friends in Aotearoa, New Zealand, kia ora. Today happens to be Alofa's birthday, so rafano kia koe, Alofa. I know that's not Samoan, that's Maori, but it'll have to do for now. Jean once said to me that history is told by the last one living. I met Jean on September 5th, 1982. He was the founder of Team Minnesota for the inaugural Gay Games. I was the founder of Team Los Angeles. When we met at the closing ceremonies, of course, there were, practically, half-naked bodies everywhere, men and women. This was San Francisco, after all. And as everyone's having this joyous experience, Jean and I are on the field, meeting for the first time, discussing all the things that we could do and how we needed to build the structure and how we could grow this from this one-off event to become a global movement. And it still exists to this day, 40 years later. But before I met Jean, I found out later on, there were so many things that he did prior to those first games happening that made those games happen. He had founded the team back in November of 1981, the same time that Tom Waddell, the U.S. Olympian who founded the Gay Games, launched the actual nonprofit. Immediately, of course, Jean, he wasn't waiting for anything. He called Tom and said, well, what can I do to help? So thanks to Jean, we have what's called the Red Book. That Red Book is all the rules and regulations that govern the sports that are part of the Gay Games. Because one didn't exist for queer sports. I mean, queer sports didn't exist outside of, bowling, softball, and pool, billiards, because they all took place at venues where alcohol was served. But this was different. So what did Jean do? Well, this was pre-internet. He picked up the phone, he wrote notes, and collected all of the governing rules for all the different sports we were doing, and he adapted them for same gender, non-gender specific, everything. And that is still to this day the rule book that guides the Gay Games. Yes, it's been approved upon, but he was the one who created that. When he heard that there was going to be a torch relay, he said, well, of course, Minnesota wants to be included. They say, well, we can only get it to Ohio, and then we can pick it up in Salt Lake City. We were just going to jump over the Midwest. Exactly. I forgot to check my notes, but I think there were about 40 cities that Jean put together. Once again, on the phone, calling his contacts, everything just to get it done. And I just, literally all the way from, eastern Ohio to Denver, Colorado, with stops along the way. And that's not easy, putting together a torch relay through Kansas and Nebraska and places where it was dangerous, and is still dangerous for our community. So, in August of 1982, when the first games happened, one of the most famous stories that still exists today, and it's legendary, is that there was a cyclist who had gotten lost on the route and ended up crossing the finish line backwards. Yes, of course it was Jean Tretter. So when Jean and I met, we created what was called the International Gay Olympic Association. It was the first governing body for the Gay Games. There were 12 of us across the US and Canada. And we had monthly conference calls, which were very expensive, because that's how much phone calls were very expensive back then, just for one calls. But yeah, for those 4 years in between Gay Games 1 and Gay Games 2, this organization existed, even though we were being sued by the U.S. Olympic Committee to not use the word Olympic. Jean also published the quarterly, we referred to it as it was the Gay Bleep Games Bulletin, or just the Bleep. And Jean produced that every quarter here in Minnesota, and it was sent out all over the world. In April of 1983, Team Minnesota presented their Winter Gay Games proposal, which was accepted, and unfortunately didn't happen because, of course, with the AIDS crisis just exploding at that time, the funds were not available. And I didn't get the details on it, but it was at that meeting in April when they were, well, should it be the gay games? Should it be the lesbian gay games? Because, of course, Minnesota, their team had more women than men at those first gay games. And so their winter event was going to be the lesbian and gay Olympic Games. But, there were a few people that didn't want that because, well, we all identified with the word gay. And Jean was the one who stood up and said, well, but I also identify as a lesbian. Now, of course, everyone thought that was funny and humorous, except Jean. He was being dead serious. It was one of the first examples of gender nonconforming that I had confronted. And again, he just, so many times he opened up our eyes to things that were just there that we never thought of. The following year, Team Minnesota hosted the first conference for the different co-chairs from all the teams. To this day, the Gay Games still has their annual meeting based upon what Jean created. In June of 1983, I was one of the people that launched the Festival Games. It was the first annual queer sports festival. It was held in Los Angeles the week before our Pride Festival. Jean flew out, stayed with me the whole week, and it was during that week that he's like, oh, so do you know Jim Kepner? And I was like, well, of course I know Jim Kepner. Everyone in LA knows Jim Kepner. He was, to this day, he's still one of the most famous archivists within our community. So Jean and I go over to his space in Hollywood, and I will always remember the one thing he said, and it stuck with me, and I became an archivist as a result. He said, if we don't preserve our history, who will? Well, Gene Tretter did. So in January of '83, I was on a layover here, and that was when we got to see the Weather Girls at some bar on Hennepin. I don't even remember. And then that is when Jean and I lost touch because, again, with Gay Games 2, everything fell apart. Tom Waddell passed away from AIDS, as did several other members within our group. It wasn't until the internet in the late 90s that, again, one of the first people was like, oh, what's that Gene Tretter guy up to? And that's when we reconnected, and when his collection moved here, I was honored to be one of the members of the advisory board for about a decade. So we reconnected in '98. Oh, then in November 2002, Gene had had a stroke. He was in the Veterans Hospital, I believe. But we had put together a nomination for him to receive the Tom Waddell Award, which is the highest award given by the Federation of Gay Games for those with exemplary and outstanding service. Gene was not selected, but he was one of the 3 finalists, but he was in the hospital. So it's like, okay, how do we get him to Australia, to Sydney, where the games were being held? Well, without James and Linnea Stinson, there's no way, because, again, the stories on that of how they sprung him and got him on a plane to LA, I'll never know. I was not going on the same flight with him to Sydney, and he was going to the conference ahead of time, the Human Rights Conference. Fortunately, some of my athletes were on the plane, so they, accompanied him all the way. And there were some very fun stories from our trip there, but I just don't have time. But one of the things after the Gay Games there, the one thing is when they did announce his name at the closing ceremonies as one of the finalists, they pronounced it as Jean-Nickolaus Tretter. Now, as you all know, Gene was very, very proud of his Norwegian heritage and German. Literally, until the day he died, we were still laughing about Mr. Tretter. Is that you? And as Dr. Kirikiri said, we traveled over to Aotearoa, New Zealand, after the games, and they were so gracious to host us. But we also went down to Wellington to see the Lesbian and Gay Archives of New Zealand, and for Jean to finally meet Phil Wilkinson, who is, to the Lagans archives, what Jean is to the Tretter collection. And so that was so nice to witness, once again, two of the greatest archivists in our community meeting and having that time to finally be together, because they had shared so many articles going back and forth and items for the collections. I'm almost finished. But one of the things that I remember from that trip also is Lofa, as she mentioned, took us to her family's marae outside of Gisborne. It was under a full moon, and her father was a master carver and one of the last remaining Maori chiefs, and who specialized, and he was hand carving every single one of these 12-foot, 6-foot wide, wood beams that are part of the structure inside. And since that time, his daughter Alofa and others have gone in and replaced the woven fabrics in between those, and it's a work of art, and it is just, it really was a magical experience. In October 2013, I had joined the board for the Federation of Gay Games, the organization that has run the Gay Games for the last 30 years. And I made certain that the legacy award that they gave out that year was to Gene. Because again, he had never been acknowledged for everything he did. Of course, Gene always said he didn't care about those things, but he did. He did. March 2017, I was so thrilled that we were able to get the Federation of Gay Games to agree to have their annual mid-year meeting here, hosted by the Tretter Collection. Of course, some of these people were from warmer climes and had never been to a Minnesota winter, even in March, so that was a fun experience. I went back to school in 2010 to finally get my degree, and I was so blessed that I got to spend a month here in January in 2010 and 2012. I actually like Minnesota winters, okay? But I only get to experience them for like 2 to 4 weeks at a time, so I can enjoy that and appreciate it. And my Midwest visits always included a trip up to here to see Gene, because again, with his health being what it was these last 20 years, he and I were the last two of those that founded that first governing body outside of San Francisco. And of course, after Tom Waddell died, there was no way the people in San Francisco were going to listen to any of us outside of the city, which is why we disbanded. But I remember waking up the morning of December 10th and thinking, wow, we now live in a world without Gene Tretter. But God bless you, Gene, your eminence, as I always called him, because we will never live in a world without the Tretter Collection. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamie. Let's see if I can make the technology work again. Among Gene's great passions in life, and he had many, the collection was, of course, his really overarching significant passion. Max played a role as well. That's his cat. But Gene loved the lore and the story of the Titanic. A beautiful hymn cherished in the Lutheran faith that Gene was raised in was played as the ship by the ship's string quartet as the great liner slipped beneath the waves. Gene asked that his service recognize his childhood Lutheran tradition in some form, and he specifically asked that this hymn, which was played as the Titanic sank, be played at his service. And he liked this version. I actually played this for him before he passed.
Mortis Celitus miles. Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee. Excelsior, 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 Excelsior. My song shall be nearer, my God, to thee. Nearer, my God, to thee. Nearer, Excelsior. Though like thunders, the sun gone down, darkness behold me, my rest alone. Excelsior, Excelsior, Excelsior. Angels to beckon me. Nearer, my God, to thee. Nearer, my God, to thee. Nearer, Excelsior, 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 Excelsior.
Technology's defeating me. By the way, Gene would absolutely be over the moon that the Brigham Young University Men's Choir sang at his funeral. At this time, I'd like to ask Lisa Vicoli, a former archivist of the Tretter collection and longtime colleague of Gene's, to speak.
Thank you all for joining us here today, either in person or online. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces. My name is Lisa Vicoli. I'm one of the original advisory board members for the Tretter collection, and it was my honor and joy to be hired as the curator of the collection when Gene retired. It's hard to capture what a remarkable thing Gene accomplished, and it's hard to describe how magical the archive is. During my tenure, I took hundreds of people on tours. Many of you are in this room. And each and every one of them was awed by the remarkable holdings in the Tretter collection. Millions upon millions of pages of information about the LGBTQ communities. The impact on students who are fortunate enough to work in the collection has been even more profound. One after another, they found themselves in the archive. Some coming out, some transitioning, some just standing taller, realizing that they stood on the shoulders of generations past. They often found ways to stay, even after graduation, just to keep in contact with the archive and the voices we preserve. On tours, I always told visitors two things about Gene. I would start with a quip that there was a fine line between a collector and a hoarder. And that Gene may have been on the wrong side of that line. Some days I said that with more humor, some days more with exasperation. Gene had an expansive view of what was gay and of what belonged in the archive. Over the years, I found his old eyeglasses, his mother's framed plastic molded rendition of The Last Supper, complete with the $2.97 price tag from Woolworth's. Full bottles of beer, which he saved for the labels. Full packages of food, nutcracker chocolates, goldfish, rainbow goldfish. The greasy saran wrap from Oscar Wilde wild cheddar cheese. I wish I were kidding. So pro tip, food and liquid are strictly prohibited in archival collecting. The other thing I told every visitor was that when Jean started collecting the materials, there was no reason to believe that anyone would ever want what he was preserving. Decades ago, Jean-Nickolaus Tretter was the first one of a dozen, 24 people in the world with the vision to see that LGBTQ history needed to be preserved. He would hang on to everything he could beg, borrow, or steal. I don't mean grand larceny. I mean that if there was an LGBTQ poster on a light pole, he would say he would archive it. If he saw a Gertrude Stein sandwich at a restaurant, clearly that menu needed to be in the collection. On a trip to Germany with the Tretter board in 2004, he asked Linnea Stenson for her plastic department store bag. She asked why, because she knew Jean. He said, well, because it had a nutcracker on it, and Tchaikovsky wrote the Nutcracker, and Tchaikovsky was gay. Therefore, the bag needed to be in the archive. I will always appreciate Linnea for refusing to give him the bag. Sometimes wiser heads prevailed. Jean had the vision, albeit overly expansive, to preserve everything that he could, and the optimism to believe that if he built it, we would come. We would see how precious the materials were, and we would step up to preserve them and make them accessible. Which begs the question, just how stubborn do you have to be to go completely against the grain of what everyone else is doing all by yourself? To which I would respond, on behalf of everyone who ever knew Jean, really, really freaking stubborn. Jean's stubborn streak long preceded the archive. In his records, I found his 1970 enlisted performance evaluation from the Navy. Among other things, his superior wrote, quote, "His performance in matters of military nature has left a lot to be desired. He has actively questioned decisions made by his seniors, and although he's never failed to obey any commands or regulations, he has often been vociferous in his dissent concerning them." Unquote. I'm quite sure that anyone who ever supervised or tried to get Jean to do something he didn't want to do can sympathize with his commanding officer. And following Jean as staff at the archive, I was faced with, quite frankly, a mess. Jean was excellent at collecting. He was not comfortable with computers. So he continued to try and manage a 2,700 linear foot collection as if it were still, 200 linear feet in his apartment. There were days that I wanted to strangle him. There are still days. Multiple times over. But even with that, I had then, and I continue have now, what I can only describe as an irrational affection for Jean. Completely irrational and deep affection for Jean. He was maddening, but he was also generous. He was frustrating and also a wealth of history. He was stubborn and also a visionary. Jean made a difference that will be felt for generations. Without him, there would not be an LGBTQ archive at the University of Minnesota. And many of the stories and artifacts that we preserve here would have been scattered and lost forever. Few, if any of us, will have the impact that Jean-Nickolaus Tretter had, not only during his life, but long into the future. We owe him a profound debt of gratitude for his stubborn dedication to all of us.
Thank you, Lisa. At this time, I'd like to ask Aidan Bettine, the current archivist at the Tretter Collection, to speak.
Hello, and thank you again, everyone, for being here, both in person and online. And thank you, Lisa, for such a lovely overview of the collection. So I feel like I get to talk about Jean's legacy and moving forward. On December 9th, 2022, we gained an ancestor. Jean-Nickolaus Tretter has made an immeasurable impact on our ability to know, share, and preserve LGBTQ history. Here in the Tretter Collection, Jean's passing has left us reflecting on his legacy that he's entrusted with us and the University of Minnesota libraries to continue to preserve LGBTQ history for generations to come. The Tretter Collection is a beacon for researchers and community members alike to learn and know and spend time with our shared history. It is a destination point, an arrival, and for many people, it is just the beginning of how to understand and become familiar with an immensely powerful history of all of us, of the community in this room, and the community around the collection. Even in my 10 months so far, I've seen so many people, so many young folks and students engage with the collection and have a moment where they realize we have always existed. We couldn't have that moment, that guidepost, that signal, that flag, without Jean walking the path before us and leaving a little rainbow trail. Maybe it's Skittles instead of breadcrumbs. It might sound cheesy, but it's true. As I've spent my time here learning the depths of the Tretter Collection, it is hard to fathom what we would not be able to know about our history without Jean. I'll echo what Lisa said. It is not a coincidence that no other university in the Midwest has a GLBT archives with a devoted, full-time curator. I could have never imagined being able to professionally work for our community in this archival capacity. I owe my career to Jean. What you've heard so far today, and you'll continue to hear in people's remarks celebrating Jean, demonstrate how long and true he was in his character and his spirit. Although I did not know Jean for very long, I'm thankful I got the opportunity to spend time with him in the months leading up to his passing and gain my own stories and understanding of who he was. But I meet Jean every time I walk through the stacks, every time I'm in the archives, and maybe to my chagrin, another unopened bottle of liquid appears on the shelf, or there's something else that maybe isn't in a box and it should be. But I feel Jean walk with me through the archive, truly as an ancestor by my side. He was tenacious. He had foresight. You'll hear it over and over again. The collection Jean built in the Midwest, nestled here in the Anderson Library, is like no other in our region. Certainly, as the newest curator, it is an honor and a true gift to steward the collection, but I'm especially humbled to steward Jean's lifelong work. I know that I am guided by all of you in this room who have loved and cared for this collection, by his family and his dearest friends, to carry forward his legacy. So to all of you, I thank you for being here and guiding me to continue on Jean's path. And thank you to Jean.
You know, just a very quick story that I didn't think of until Aidan was actually speaking. For those of you who knew Jean, you knew at the end of Jean's life that he struggled with his eyesight a great deal. And so he often went off of audio, what he could hear. And he made a remark to me one day that he thought Aidan sounded really hot. You know, Jean had good taste. So thank you, Aidan. We appreciate you being here. Many years ago, the Twin Cities Gay Men's Chorus decided to entrust their historical and archival material to the Tretter Collection. Jean loved the chorus passionately and was thrilled to be able to preserve their rich and wonderful legacy. Today we are honored to have the Twin Cities Gay Men's Chorus Chamber Singers with us, led by Artistic Director Dr. Gerald Gers.
worry not your minds, for when the sun shines bright, at last I shall master this fight. Quiet now is your hearts, and please no tears. Now is the ending of my part, as the light throws down all fears. Tonight you watch in mournful sadness, but when the sun shines, my spirit will renew its gladness. When dawn shines.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much. My turn. Thank you again, everybody, for being here today to honor our family member, Jean-Nickolaus Tretter. My name is James Garlow, and I have been a close friend of Jean's for just shy of 25 years. I said at the beginning that we are family because everyone here is a member of Jean's biological family or Jean's chosen family. Even if you never met Jean, he would consider you family. As LGBTQIA plus people, all too often we don't feel welcome or accepted in our families of origin. So many of us choose our family. We create families and select friends from those who make us laugh, those who make us feel safe, those who make us feel loved, those who understand our struggles, and those who love us. Many of us here today were chosen by Jean to be a part of his family. I consider being among you today an honor, and while I did not know Jean as long as some of you have, I cherish Jean's friendship, like I said, for almost 25 years. As you know, and as we've talked about already today, and you'll hear variations on the theme, Jean was brilliant and a visionary, or at least a compulsive hoarder turned accidental archivist. Along with brilliance often comes some eccentricity, and Jean had occasional moments. Like when he asked me to pick up the candy thrown by drag queens at a pride parade so that he could keep it in the collection. After all, it was gay candy. But aside from that, Jean loved and valued his family and friends loyally and ferociously. Shortly before he left us, Jean and I spoke about some characteristics that meant something to him in this lifetime, and I'd like to briefly share these with you. First one was being trustworthy. Jean was trustworthy. Ever a man of his word, if Jean agreed to do something, it got done, even if you had to do it for him. Jean valued trust and integrity. Loyalty. Jean was loyal. Jean was a loyal friend and fierce advocate for LGBTQIA rights, and more importantly, for the dignity of all people to live their lives free of fear and violence. Jean was helpful. If you ever needed to know how to do something or how it should be done, Jean was ready to let you know, even if he would explain to you that you had to do it yourself. Jean was friendly. Jean would talk to anyone. Perhaps his favorite thing to do in life was to hold court at Pride in the History Pavilion, where he would spend hours telling younger LGBTQIA plus people all about their history, often startling them, as many didn't even realize that they have a shared history. He was an excellent storyteller, and he loved to learn more about people and tell them about himself and the collection. Courteous. Jean was courteous. He used terms of respect, sir and ma'am, master and Mrs. Mr. and Mrs., I'm sorry, not master. Well, maybe. I didn't know him that well, contrary to popular rumor. He'd been taught these things as a child and in the military. Jean also recognized early on that addressing a person by their preferred term of address was a small thing, but it showed respect, and it was the right thing to do. Jean would also show courtesy by pressing the handicap button on the building doors when I was carrying his stuff into the building, usually. Kind. Jean was kind. He displayed his kindness in how he would take care of his LGBTQIA plus family and his family of origin in any way he could. He'd welcome people to the archive, and he would help them to find the materials they needed for their research, even if it took hours of his time. He'd go out of his way to be sure that they had everything they needed and were taken care of. And he always had time for his fans. Jean loved December 6th with a passion. The 6th is St. Nicholas Day. Jean always wanted everyone to celebrate with him, because it was, to Jean, it was me day. Traditionally, on the 5th, children leave a single boot or shoe outside of the door of either of their bedroom or of their home. And then that is magically filled overnight with chocolate and sweets. So to be sure that everyone in his apartment building had a treat on St. Nicholas Day, Jean would go around and leave chocolate St. Nick's at everyone's door in his apartment building. And I thought that was sort of kitschy. But one day, a very elderly woman resident in that building that I met in the elevator, who'd seen me many times, told me that the chocolate St. Nick was the only gift she got for Christmas. Jean was kind like that. Jean was obedient. Well, as Lisa Vicoli said, maybe the Navy didn't think so. And I really can't swear, I know Wendy's here, I can't swear to the administrators at the library feeling the same way either. But while I never met her, I never had that privilege, I have been told that Jean did obey his mother. Jean was cheerful. He had a rather dry sense of humor, but he was always ready to laugh. Often a phone call from Jean would begin with a joke. He really did love silly humor. One joke I could always get a groan from him for was when I would ask Jean why the bubble gum crossed the road. He'd roll his eyes and tolerate my silliness as I explained that the bubble gum crossed the road because it was attached to the chicken. You have to be a certain age to get that. Yeah, and my jokes are truly lame. But then Jean, being Jean, would want to know how the gum got attached to the chicken in the first place. Who put it there? What kind of gum it was? How the chicken got rid of it on the other side. If the gum was made by a gay worker, sold by a gay clerk, or came as part of a gay gift basket at Pride. He asked me if chickens could chew gum, and if so, if 4 out of 5 gay dentists recommended chewing gum for optimum beak health. Jean found great humor in those questions, and those silly discussions over shared 3-hour-long meals formed the basis of many, many pleasant evenings over the years where we collectively solved all the world's problems and agreed that tours of the collection would solve all human problems for all time. Generally, we agreed that most issues could be solved with good food, patience, understanding, and of course, cat treats. Speaking of cats, after the physicians at the VA told Jean he could no longer live in an apartment with a dirt floor in St. Paul, Jean lived with me for almost a year, while the 500 Dale Street place was still under construction. While there, Jean made friends with my cats. He had never had a cat before, and he was unsure of these opinionated and mysterious creatures. After all, cats are not dogs, and he knew all about dogs, but he didn't know about cats, and they didn't know about him. I told Jean that cats are often independent, but if they choose you, they are loyal and they are loving. But you have to be kind and gentle with them. And Jean took my words to heart, and he spent hours petting them and talking to them and giving them kitty snacks. Bribery with snacks works with cats. Come to think of it, Jean was a lot like my cats. Jean and the cats love to eat. They talk all the time. They often fall asleep in front of the TV. They have opinions they're not shy about letting you know. And once you're part of their family, they are fiercely loyal. So at my home, Jean learned how to cat. When Dale Street opened, Nicole took Jean to the shelter to find a pet, and that's where Jean and Maximilian met. Jean loved Max unconditionally, and Max, well, Max is a cat. Thrifty. Jean was thrifty. As Lisa has discussed, there's a fine line between archivist and obsessive-compulsive hoarder. Allow me to say that if he needed it, Jean generally already had it somewhere. A lot of it was here in this building. Jean was brave. He didn't look it, but Jean was incredibly brave. He was born at a time when most people thought that the word gay only meant lighthearted and carefree. He served honorably in the United States Navy at a time when his sexual orientation was a crime punishable by 5 years imprisonment, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and dishonorable discharge. That dishonorable discharge carried lifelong devastating consequences as a kind of scarlet letter that prevented people from getting work, finding housing, obtaining a loan, having a profession, or otherwise participating in society in a meaningful way. In fact, some people who received less than honorable discharges from the military for their sexual orientation still suffer the consequences to this day. Jean and his friends knew that society's attitudes towards LGBTQIA+ people were simply wrong, and he wanted to change that. He once said to me that if we don't preserve our history, if we don't write our history, they will write it for us. And if they write it, it'll be a lie. He stood on the front lines of LGBTQIA rights movement in Minnesota from the beginning and later on the world stage, even if it meant he could lose his job, be shunned by people he knew, be arrested or prosecuted under the sodomy laws in the state of Minnesota. Back then, capture the fag was a favorite sport of police departments, and there was no leniency. This just scratches the surface of Jean Tretter's bravery. Even in death, Jean is still being brave. On June 5th, I took a couple pride flags to Jean's grave. On June 7th, less than 48 hours later, they were missing. A week ago, Thursday, Nicole took pride flags to Jean's grave, and by Wednesday, they were gone. I didn't check today, but last night they were still there. Did you check today? Did not check today, okay. They were still there last night. We will continue to replace those flags as many times as we have to. And I invite anybody who is here today who goes to visit Jean's grave to place a pride flag next to his grave. And for those of you who don't know, just to make sure that everybody does know, if I can find it, well, I can't find it, I changed it. The location of his gravesite is section 42, site 937. We have a map. And we have a map. We invite you to visit his gravesite. The Veterans Administration will not remove those things. We'll replace them for as long as we need to. Clean. Jean was clean. I rarely heard Jean use four-letter words, but when he did, it was a doozy. Jean was reverent. He was reverent in his own way. The Navy wasn't so sure, but Jean did respect authority. However, he was not shy about speaking his truth to power, which sometimes got him in a bit of hot water. While speaking his truth, Jean would make his point, but generally refrained from the ad hominem attacks so favored by the pundits today. Jean believed that respectfully presenting your case would allow the truth to shine through. And the truth, for Jean, was what mattered. Jean had no illusions about the state of LGBTQIA+ rights today. Frankly, he was concerned for the future, and he asked me to relay to everyone that the struggle is not over. Jean believed that doing good in life by collecting everything was second only to the importance of his family. Something that I was deeply privileged to witness was Jean's love for his niece, Nicole Ringrose, her husband, Mike, and their children, Lauren, Colin, and Daniel. Nicole, Mike, and Colin are with us today, as is Jean's great-nephew, Alexander Baglio. And I believe Mike's mother is here as well. For Nicole, Jean would go to her events, and he was always there for the holidays, family outings, and anything she needed. He'd take her shopping and out to eat where they'd talk about the important things in life: boys, Chinese food, and gay history. Jean would encourage Nicole to be whatever she wanted to be because he knew she could do it. Jean once told me that Nicole represented the only opportunity he would have in this lifetime to experience some of the joy of being a parent, and he was so grateful to the universe for allowing him to be a part of Nicole's life and for her being a part of his. Nicole, I know that you know this, but Jean truly loved you with all of his heart, and he was so proud of the person you've become and of your family. But he still wants his spice jars back. It's a long story, we'll tell you later. For Jean, Nicole was much more than a niece. She was the most important person in his life after his mother and after his cat, Max. If you knew Jean, you'd know it was impossible to spend more than 5 minutes with him without getting filled in on all the news in Nicole and Mike's lives and getting updated on their children. Jean loved his family fiercely, and he brought that love of family to all of us as well. Nicole, I'm so sorry for your loss, and I wish to thank you and your family for sharing Jean with all of us and allowing us to honor him today. Thank you. Jean was many things to many people. He was an uncle, a great uncle, a friend, an archivist, a colleague, a scholar, a broadcaster, a cat dad, and so many more. He was a complex human being who, through his foresight and dogged determination, gave the LGBTQI+ world our shared stories collected in one place in the Upper Midwest for all to study and learn from. Jean, thank you for a life well lived, for allowing me to be a tiny part of it, and for preserving the stories of all of us with dignity and thoughtfulness. I hope that you've had an opportunity, as I've spoken today, to reflect on who Jean was to you. I ask that you please keep Jean in your thoughts as we move forward with our own lives, and that you tell others about the gay Navy veteran from Little Falls, Minnesota, who tenaciously preserved LGBTQIA+ history for us all.
Before we sing, I just want to say thank you to James, the family, for allowing us to serve somebody who has served us.
When the clock strikes 12 and another year has gone, I give a kiss to you as remembrance of the past we have shared and the future yet to come. We toast the days both good and bad, the old friends and the new. When the clock strikes 12 and another year has gone, I give a kiss to you. While the night is long and the bitter cold has come, we lengthen our embrace to sustain us as we mourn our regrets and the fear of days unknown. We toast the days both good and bad, the old friends and the new. While the night is long and the bitter cold has come, I give a kiss to you. As we stand on the edge of another brighter year,
There's been a slight change in the order of events, and I apologize, but I ask you to bear with me. I think you'll enjoy it. So our second to last speaker today will be Jean's niece, Nicole Ringrose.
Hi. So James told me if I go over 5 minutes that music will start playing, like in the Oscars. It was amazing. Thank you so much. And I'm going to talk for an hour just so you guys can sing through me. James, thank you so much for the touching tribute to Jean. James talks about Jean's sense of humor. Of course, classic Uncle Gene. It seems that he did get the last laugh. During one of my visits with him at the VA hospital, in an attempt to raise his spirits, I told him that James would be stopping by in the morning. Jean's response, he's not my type. But with all sincerity, James, what a beloved friend you have always been to Jean and to me. So thank you. Gene Tretter was my uncle, my mom's brother. Mom and her two older brothers called him Pinky because of his curly red hair. She told me stories about her boyfriends letting Pinky tag along on their dates because he was such a charming little guy. I think it's appropriate to emphasize that Gene's family loved and supported him unconditionally. He and I had a special connection since I, too, was the baby of the family, being the youngest of his many nieces and nephews. Gene never forgot a birthday and would make a point to take me out for lunch and shopping each year. We always came home with a birthday cake to share and stories to last a lifetime. Gene also called me Coley, my childhood nickname. This confused countless people as I grew older. And for the two of us, it was always a good laugh. I can't tell you how many times we explained that I was not his daughter, his wife, or his girlfriend. I'm Coley, his niece. After Gene passed away in December, I sadly thought that would be the end of Coley. After all, he was the last of his generation in my family. But it's funny how this community works. Within hours of Gene's passing, I was flooded with phone calls, texts, and emails asking for Coley. It's been a blessing to see that I am recognized within Gene's community. I now would like to share something that was very important to Uncle Gene. It's a poem by Martin Niemöller. In 1937, Niemöller was arrested by the Nazis and eventually sent to Dachau. He was freed in 1945 and became a leading voice for peace after war. The poem was part of a 1946 speech Niemöller gave in Frankfurt. The poem clearly resonated with Gene. He believed that everyone is deserving of love and protection, and it was his life's mission to speak out for others. The poem is First They Came by Martin Niemöller. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then They came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. Uncle Gene, it will not be forgotten that you were there to speak out for those who felt they did not have a voice. Thank you for forging the path for others to become their authentic selves. I'm proud that your name will not be forgotten. And as my daughter Lauren said, rest in pride, Uncle Gene. Thank you for looking out for the best in others and giving us the best you had. Thank you.
Thank you, Coley. Oh, I made the bad. Okay, less bad noise. We did not have the technology completely solved here before this was done, but we decided that it would be a wonderful thing because we have the ability to give the last word to Jean-Nickolaus Tretter.
What did you know what you were getting into when you first started to kind of amass some of this stuff?
I kind of vaguely knew. I didn't realize how large it would get and the extent to which it would grow. But why collect was because I found out when I went to do a display for the Pride Committee in 1983 that everything was disappearing. People did not save lesbian and gay things. And as fast as our community was producing stuff, it was disappearing.
What did you bring with us here today?
Well, a number of different things. I brought a pair of buttons here from Harvey Milk, the supervisor in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. This is one of his campaign buttons, and then this was a memorial button for him and George Moscone after they were assassinated back in 1978. Among the other things, I know you mentioned an interest in the starlight crystals. Right. These are Minnesota starlight orthorhombic prisms. They're twinned at 60 and 90 degrees, but they're also known as fairy stones. And during the late 60s and early 70s, they were very popular with members of the gay and lesbian community here in Minnesota. They're really only found up near Little Falls in Morrison County. And people would go up there and find them. It was an adventure to look for them. And then they'd have them made into jewelry because they were fairy stones.
Why is it important to collect these things, to have these sorts of artifacts?
Well, why is it important for the government to spend as much money as they did preserving the flag? You know, that was that we wrote the national anthem about. You know, we spend millions of dollars on that. Everybody needs that connection. You need to know where you came from. And I can remember when I first started out and when I first started lecturing on gay and lesbian history, people would laugh at me and say, there is no such thing. You know, people were so much in denial of GLBT people that they just denied it totally. And also it gives you kind of an inner strength. And I would point to, I guess, the best example of that are the Jewish people that survived World War II. You know, part of knowing their history and their 5,000-year history was one of the things that helped them survive in concentration camps.
You have a number of books here too, by the way, Jean.
Right, and this, since I was speaking about the Jewish people, this is a good example. In 1933, the Nazis burned the Magnus Hirschfeld Library.
Yes.
And yeah, that was, at that time, the largest collection of gay and lesbian items in the world. This is actually like an 1898 French version of the works of the Marquis de Sade. What the book is not important. What is important is this book was, when they were burning the books are very hard to burn, you know. And after the Nazis got done marching around and everything like that and started leaving, they put the flames out, and some courageous people smuggled this book, found it at the bottom, not totally burned, smuggled it into Switzerland, where it was acquired by a book dealer who was then acquired by a book dealer in California from whom I then eventually acquired it.
The U of M will have your collection soon.
Yes.
Why the U of M?
Number one, because there's a large number of Minnesota items in there. Number two, because they were very, very cooperative about the collection and the accessioning and deaccessioning. And because I'm a native Minnesotan. My family's been here, we're pre-territorial pioneers. We've been here since 1858, or 1848, excuse me.
So it makes sense.
Yes.
Gene, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for being on Almanac.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. And I would like to thank you to Dean German for allowing us to use this magnificent space to honor and remember Jean. I wish to thank Dr. Gerald Gers and the members of the Twin Cities Gay Men's Chorus Chamber Singers for honoring Jean today. Thank you. Thank you, Lisa, Aiden, Andy, Shamie, for your hard work in making this event possible, and thank you all for honoring Jean today. As we conclude the ceremony today, we ask that you join us for some snacks and fellowship in the atrium. However, we have one last and extremely important order of business. I ask that you help us honor Jean's adamant last request, that his service must end with Over the Rainbow. He asked this because he wanted the service to reflect hope and to end on a joyful note. Here is Israel Kamakavivole, I got it, beautiful version of Over the Rainbow. Please, if you have those flags, hold them up. If you don't, that's okay, but hold them up. And sing along as we together remember and celebrate the life of Jean-Nickolaus Tretter.
That's where you find me.
Gene would have liked the cheering. That was for Gene. Gene's favorite part of the service has arrived. Let's eat.